It's been a long time coming. Here is Dump. Just realised mine has a scribble on it. Never noticed that before. Maybe I can convince myself it is a signature. Maybe Van Morrison signed this one. Not the writer, the singer, Van Morrison. Brown-eyed girl. Maybe he signed my copy of this for that very reason. This is issue 20 of Dome People, written by Van Morrison, the writer, not the singer. They Them wrote this one, and it is part 2 of They Them Their first story, Crawling from the Wreckage. Looked at part 1 a while back. You might remember that video gave birth to the internet's favourite comedy character. Well, I wonder what part 2 will bring. We open with a small sequence that I just know, some of the more jaded of you lot, Mark Shalusky, I'm looking straight at you, you will consider this attempt at the surreal to be limp. You won't appreciate this whimsy. We have a Catholic priest. He is walking through some of the destruction left by the DC crossover Evasion, and he sees a sign that says, "Have faith in God." But there is a fish on the sign, obscuring the G and making it look like it says, "Have faith in cause." And then it starts raining fish, but he is disappointed because none of the fish are actually cause. And then what happens is he gets crushed by a giant refrigerator. Now I am going to crowbar open your mind, Mark Shalusky. What Van Morrison does here is no different from anything Steve Gerbil would do. This is complete and utter Steve Gerbil madness. Remember when Doctor Strange found his house transformed into a big box of cereal? It's right in line with something Steve Gerbil would do. The Steve Gerbil comparison sort of ends there, the opening scene. Although I would half expect Steve Gerbil to explore gender ambiguity in a similar way. The Invisible Man, Claude Rains, classic Dome People member, he is now merged with a lady doctor, and they are the Invisible Man together. But the Invisible Man is basically non-binary. It is gender fluid now. The Invisible Man, let's say that it is an ironic name this time. Well, actually, it wants to be called Griffin. It's Griffin. Half man, half woman, half biscuit. Van Morrison, of course, came out as non-binary a while back. Someone clicks thumbs down on my videos whenever I call them Van Morrison. That is a deal breaker for them. They don't care that I have, since Van Morrison came out, I have consistently referred to them by correct pronouns. Although I think I remember seeing Van Morrison say that they didn't care about what pronouns you use for them. I bring Van Morrison's gender up because this stuff with the Invisible Man, with Griffin, it has added meaning to it, and it might be some of the most personal insight into Van Morrison's idea on gender. Look at the way they, them are sitting. I know a kid who would be outraged at this. I do want to quickly say, I think it's a bit needless for Van Morrison to have dragged in the lady doctor, because you could have just used remnants of the Invisible Woman from the new Dome People to justify the gender thing. We knew he was showing up this round, didn't we? It's Raging 15-year-olds. He's been busy lately making 80 videos about how he hates the Fantastic Force movie that isn't out yet. You got anything to add to this conversation, Raging 15-year-olds? I think Pedro Pascal is a...
Shout at the devil, shout, 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 shout at the devil.
Oh, look, what's this? It is my new comedy character, Raging 15-year-old's dad, who I found out is also on YouTube. I wonder what revelations he can provide us into how Raging 15-year-old came to be the way he is. Of course, when Conor McGregor gets into power, he's going to deport all the Black Lives Matter pro-Palestine savages and send them back to Africa where they belong, and we can finally walk down the Irish high street without fear of being bombed. Yeah, that about checks out. Real, by the way, same background. To get back to this, we have our first proper appearance of the villains for this story, the Scissor Men. They are... I can never remember really. I know they are based on a German nursery rhyme or a German children's book or something like that. The Scissor Men, they are based on something like that. I think in DC continuity, they're just aliens. They come from another dimension at least. They speak gibberish mainly, and they can do this to people. They can cut them out, erase them, kinda. Like the Living Eraser from Marvel. They're sort of like that. After this, Griffin, they ask to be called Griffin. And then they start stripping. So that is when Professor X, Timothy Dalton, he asks Griffin if they want to join the Dome people again. Robot Man, Brendan Fraser's, funny guy, Brendan Fraser's, he is in a mental hospital. And he has developed a friendship with another patient called Painkiller Jane. She has over 50 personalities, and the one she is currently using is called Driver 8, which I assume... I even did a quick Google to make sure I don't look stupid saying this, but I assume Driver 8 must be a reference to the song by R.E.M. from their worst album. Ganon, tell me how there is some John Keats poem or something called Driver 8 in the comments. The prophesying patient from last issue is thrown out the window and dies, saying the Scissor Men's name over and over. Then we have another scene. This one is set on the subway. And a problem I encounter with Van Morrison comics a lot, even those I have read a few times like this, is that it's never clear to me as a reader if I have not understood something or if he hasn't given us the key to understanding it yet. We have this guy and he has stolen something, and this is absolutely that guy who I mentioned in part 1 seemed to steal something in the background. The janitor at the hospital. It wasn't focused on, and I didn't understand what it was trying to convey, what it meant, what it was about. And I reckon I'm not alone in never having linked these two scenes, because in part 1, it was coloured black. But yeah, the object is the same, or seems to be the same. And it's very possible in part 3, we will get some more knowledge of this, more context. Maybe they're not the same person. Maybe they are. Maybe we won't have anything more of this. It's Van Morrison. Their comics often have this harsh difficulty curve when it comes to understanding. You are always asking yourself if you understand it. And then when you don't, you sometimes find out you weren't meant to understand it yet. And the thing is, bits like that, I never remember. I maybe remember the first thing and not understanding it, but when the actual explanation is slowly given to us, I don't know where this strand here goes. And I have read this story a dozen times. Painkiller Jane, she is bleeding. Joining with that overall feeling of confusion, a lot of it is cryptic early on. Cryptic references to summit coming, a mental patient uttering the name Scissor Men, this bit with Painkiller Jane. I can't remember if I actually said so in part 1, but Painkiller Jane will be a long-term character in this series. I've not read much of it. I've only really gone with the first few issues of it, but she remains a presence in this series. After this title concluded, she kind of goes away for a while. She doesn't feature in a lot of the subsequent Dome People series. Although they did do a recent one where she was now, her new personality was that she had become Professor X. She had become Timothy Dalton. She became the leader of the Dome People. Robot Man and Painkiller Jane encounter the Scissor Men. They speak in non sequiturs and have scissors for hands. And then here we see a scarier use for their erasure thing. They have cut out just parts of a person. A doctor at the hospital. They have cut out his arms and legs and some of his back. So I was talking about this story's clarity, and I am speaking from a bit of a personal perspective. First time I ever read this, didn't like it at all. I thought it was vague, and the Scissor Men were just that. They were vague. The second time I read it, I completely got it. I really understood it. Everything clicked. Maybe not the janitor stealing the thing, but overall the story really worked for me. With this time, with this reading, I feel like the things that make the Scissor Men work in my subsequent reads might be lost in breaking this story up into its issues. The final page shows us madness happening around the world, like John Lennon's waxwork in Madame Tussauds starts bleeding from his bullet wounds and stuff like that. It goes without saying, but this montage of chaos by Van Morrison is better than Tom Beavor's attempt at the same thing in Defenders. That's a fair comparison, right? Two equally as revered writers. Before we end, we have an advert for Justice League Europe. An advert that surprisingly didn't run much at all. I still think I recommend it. Yeah, read the first volume of the trade. I think that volume is some of my favourite non-excellent men, Van Morrison. The first trade has this story, a two-parter, which is even better, and then a standalone issue. They're all great. I don't like what follows, but that first trade is great. Maybe you won't get the Scissor Men the first time either. Maybe that bloke stealing something has no bearing on anything, and I am focusing on it for no reason. One thing's for sure, when Conor McGregor gets into power, this comic will probably still be decent enough. 7 thumbs up.